Morning, everyone. Thanks very much for taking the time to come along. I have the unenviable task of, in about half an hour, giving you every answer you might need to improve your tenders. So stay awake, everyone. We'll be going through it a bit of a pace. I'm hopefully going to leave a little bit of time before the break for any questions as well. So if there are issues that you've had with your bids or improving the score, we'll see if we can get those fitted in as well. So, top tips for tendering. One of the things in our experience after about 10 years certainly working with the Scottish public sector bids is the fact that it's a competition, and I think that's one of the areas that's most difficult sometimes for all of us to get to grips with. There's a terrible tendency, particularly if you're the one doing the tenders, that it becomes quite administrative. And it's here's another tender, you fill it in, you've got the same old answers. It needs a bit more than that, and it's so competitive now with everything being advertised openly. You really do have to do as much as you can to get those scores, and sadly it does literally come down to numbers and the scores and the evaluation that you get. It's complex, so by the time you've answered a typical tender, you've probably touched on virtually every part of your business. Your people, your pricing, your technical capability. Paul Chapman was speaking earlier about cyber essentials, so that's the next thing that's going to be hitting us as well, particularly as smaller providers that we need to get to grips with. So plenty to be going on with. So I've tried to highlight in the short time that we do have some of the areas that I think you can focus on to maybe sharpen your pencil, as the saying goes. So the first one that we're going to look at is researching the market and say a little bit about that, because it is important. If you've got limited resources, you can't necessarily go for absolutely everything. I'm going to say a little bit about what we call the dreaded ESPD. For any of you that are tendering, you'll know this as one of the pre-qualification documents. So I'm going to say a little bit about that and how you can get yourself geared up and ready to make that a bit easier. We're then going to talk about the actual tender content and the sort of tips and hints for filling in the actual forms, and also mention community benefits, because that's an area that some of us struggle a little bit to understand what's being looked for. And then finally, just finishing up with a little bit on the tender library and how you might look to get things a bit more organised. So, researching the market, I suppose, with my SDP hat on, because we do a lot of training for the Supplier Development Programme, I would certainly encourage you, you'll all be registered because you've had to register to come along to today's event, to make sure that you keep an eye out on the newsletters from SDP, but actually go onto the SDP website, because all the events like this one here are advertised on the events calendar. We've seen quite a few quite interesting events that are set up perhaps related to some of the big infrastructure projects or a particular buyer. So again, a quick check, you can look at the calendars just months ahead and get yourself booked in. There's also resources on the SDP website, in particular policy templates. So that's something we get asked about quite a lot. So equality and diversity, environmental policy. So take a look at stpscotland.co.uk as a good starting point. I'm going to focus the rest of the discussion on researching the market on Public Contracts Scotland. Could I just ask who's registered with PCS? Excellent, so really quite a lot. We're very lucky in Scotland because this really is, in terms of public sector, this is the only portal that we need to be tracking to look for opportunities. So anything valued over £50,000 must be published on PCS. So if you're looking at south of the border, there's all sorts of other portals that you maybe have to look at in parallel. So on the PCS, once you have registered, we tend to put in our keywords, and probably most of us maybe just wait and see what opportunities get sent through the email. I would encourage you to be a bit more proactive though. Log in and actually within your teams, if you're lucky to have people that you're working with, or this is actually a good student project if you have someone in as a placement, start to do a bit of research round about the buyers that you're interested in and also the areas, the products, the services that you're looking for. These are just screenshots. I've not gone live onto the system for the time being, but if you click on the supplier tab, it'll come up with what they call the supplier control panel, and on the left-hand side are quite a number of different search activities. So I've highlighted first of all the search for buyer here, and you can actually use this if you were looking, I don't know, say it was a Highland Council, CalMac, somebody up here that you were interested in and weren't sure what they were doing in the way of procurement. Search for buyer is going to take you into their profile. It's going to tell you what contracts are there already, what contracts are coming up, so you can start to build together a nice picture of different specific organisations that you're interested in. The contracts register at the bottom I'll come on to shortly, and that's a slightly different way of searching. So sticking with the search for buyer, it may be that you're not particularly looking for an individual organisation to research, but you might just be looking to expand your horizons. We deal with dozens of SMEs every month almost, and they always seem to be quite focused on the council, the NHS, some of the really big buyers. And the trouble is, these organisations put out contracts that are really quite significant, quite high risk. So if you're an SME, if you're a new start or a social enterprise, it might be that it's just a little bit beyond your capability, particularly as a startup. There are literally, I can't actually remember the last count, but 800-900 different types of buying organisations on PCS. So I would encourage you to maybe have a look at some of those and work out if they take in your services or your products. And one of the ways you can do this, just on the search box on the left-hand side, you can put in the type of buying organisation rather than the name. There's a drop-down list. One of them, I think the acronym is Scottish Non-Departmental Public Bodies, which sounds a bit exotic. All that is something that's not a central government body. So things like Scottish Canals, Creative Scotland, we might call them kind of quangos, but that kind of agency. And they buy everything. Desks, chairs, training, vehicles. So it could be that your products may be sitting in one of these smaller organisations that it's actually worth a look. Housing associations, so how many people have housing associations as a target audience at all? Yeah, again, literally hundreds on PCS. You can type in housing or housing association and it will bring you up the full list with contact details. And these are the sort of people, if it's not a tender situation, you're perfectly within your rights to phone them up. Do a bit of research first, so don't kind of go in blind and say, we produce, audio-visual equipment. Are you buying it already under contract? Ask them about quick quotes. Can I just check again, is anyone familiar with the quick quotes? Okay, a few people. Quick quotes is used by the public sector for any procurement that's under £50,000 value. The big difference for us as a supplier is that they don't publish them on PCS. The only way you find out about them is when they've been awarded. Okay, so if you want to be considered, you need to get yourself known to the public bodies. So again, that's an important part of your research. On PCS, there's something called the Supplier Finder Profile, which again, when you register, you're usually asked to fill that in. Please make sure you've filled it in and make sure that you've ticked public at the top of it so that you're visible to the buyers. Because if I have a quick quote to provide for my multimedia equipment, I'm going to go onto PCS and look up what is effectively a big list of all of us with our profiles. So we can't go in and see that list. We can only see our own, but the buyers can. If you're not visible, you might not get the chance to be invited for a quick quote. If you're going round the various buyers today, ask them about quick quotes as well, not just the tenders. Okay, so this is still the kind of area of search the buyer, but even in that alone, you can see there's quite a lot that you can start to have a look at and see. You can also do a search by location. So in this one here, I've isolated, say, Highlands and Islands, so that you're not getting necessarily buyers that are out with your geographical area. Okay, and then once you've done your search, you'll get a big long list in some situations, depending on how wide your search is, of various things. Contract notices, so that's ones that are open that you can bid for, you'll see the deadline. Contract awards, so you've obviously missed it, but it might be quite useful to see who's won. It might be you want to get into the supply chain, for example, so you don't want the main contract, you just want to be bidding into whoever has won the contract. You'll get something called prior information notices, so that's usually for kind of bigger contracts, and they'll say, right, this is going out to tender in a few months, but it gives you time to kind of get mobilised, search for partners if you're going to go in as a consortium. And then obviously the contract awards is very informative as well, and you'll get the quick quote awards at that point as well. This is the format, so you get the title, and you'd obviously have to click into that to get more details. And on the left-hand side, some of you will be familiar with these icons. So the Scottish flag tells you this is a regulated contract, so it's been between 50,000 and what are currently the European thresholds. So it's about 180,000 for services. There's a European flag currently, which is anything over and above the threshold. And it'll also tell you with the icons where you're going to get the documents. So if it's a notice with a small paperclip, it's all sitting on PCS. If it's this funny little icon, you probably don't see at the bottom, like a box with an arrow, it's on the PCS tender system. So I'm not going to go into that today, but that is a completely separate system for actually submitting your tender. So you need to be aware of that too. Okay, so that was using the search for buyer. This is what happens when you click on the Contracts Register tab. And this is something that's been around for about 2 to 3 years now, and every public body is obliged to have a register of every contract that they hold over and above a certain threshold. And lots of people have them really quite low value, so that's interesting for us as small bidders. So if you click on the tab for the Contracts Register, you're given a search box, and again, you can use it in different ways, but generally search with a few keywords. All you're going to find there is contracts already in place, so beware you can't actually bid for them. But it's a very useful way to start to build up competitor profiles. You used to be able to get the contract value, but that's been withheld now, unfortunately. But you'll get a list of who's won the contracts and the suppliers, and you'll get the dates when it's renewed. So again, quite often with clients, one of the first things we'll do is go in, do some searching on PCS and draw up a schedule. You say, right, in the next 2 years, here's all the contracts coming along that you're going to have to keep track of. And that way you're not surprised, you're not going to miss it when it comes out on PCS. When you do your search on the Contracts Register, you get a slightly different list. So you'll get the list of the titles. It's very frustrating that you don't get anything here as to who the buyer is at this level, so you've literally kind of got to go in one by one, or I think there is an opportunity to put it out as like an Excel report, and then you'll get everything there. Okay, but you can see clearly start, finish dates, any extensions, and it'll also tell you if it's part of a wider framework. Now, a framework, I think most of you who are bidding will be familiar, but it's effectively a kind of approved list or grouping. You bid to get on a framework, but there's no guarantee of work. All it is it lets you through the door. And if it's not a framework, then it will be what they call a term contract, and that would normally go to just one supplier. Okay, so the contracts register definitely very useful, particularly for some quite small contracts. So here's a list. This is a recent one that's gone out for some training. So the supplier tab will give you, and if there's multiple lots, you'll get the longer list as well of all the suppliers. These are the links. So I think the slides are available, Gillian, to most people. So you'll get all these links embedded in the slides afterwards. Is anybody supplying outside of Scotland or interested? No, it's a few, one or two. So these are like Contracts Finder, again, it's a bit like the PCS equivalent. You've got Wales, you've got Northern Ireland, and all of them currently publish all the what we call the EU level information as well. So there's quite an activity, as I say, to find and get yourself geared up for the contracts. The next decision really that you need is a good bid, no bid decision. It can be hugely time consuming to fill in the tenders and then really like halfway through find out that it's actually not the bid for you. Part of the critical thing, I'll mention it later on as well, is reading all the documents. So a good kind of briefing document to start with, pull out all the minimum criteria. I've seen on numerous occasions people have sent us tenders, they've spent days and days, and they haven't noticed that there's a minimum turnover level, and they've literally just had to dump everything that they've done. So as soon as you can, any of the kind of pass-fail type issues, pull those out. Some of those issues, when we come to talk about the ESPD, there's an opportunity now when you bid to rely on other entities, is the terminology that they use. So if you find a bid and the turnover is too high that you can't reach the minimum, there's always an opportunity to engage with either somebody as a partner, as a consortium. I had one last week that was doing digital signage, and they used the turnover of their supply chain partner, who's a massive American company, so they've got the turnover. So buyers will take that on a case-by-case basis, but it's definitely worth pursuing if you think you might get closed off for that. Check if it's divided into lots, because obviously something with 2 or 3 lots is going to be much easier for you if you can only supply one part or another. If there aren't any lots and it's all bundled into one, that might already make the decision for you. Or you start looking at getting partners. The location obviously can be important. Any investment that you're going to need, so you're going to have to buy equipment. Again, for small companies, this is very important because it could be that you have to make all the investment in staff, uniforms, vehicles, but your first payment of the contract might not be for a few months. So you need to know that you've got the cash flow and the resources to cover that. Resources for the job is one thing. So, who are you going to need? Do you need to recruit? But do you have the resources for the bid as well? Because realistically, folk are going to have to come out of their day-to-day job and spend a reasonable amount of time putting the tender together. It's always a difficult decision. Sometimes people get the notice too late and it's due, like in 2 or 3 days' time. So, do you put a bid in that's last minute that looks pretty poor? Or do you think, well, actually, we don't want to do that, we're going to wait and bid for something else? Track record with the client is important, but at the end of the day, the client's going to read your tender as if they don't know you at all. They're not allowed to give you any kind of credence or brownie points unless it's something you've written in your documents. That's hugely, hugely important. We had a client in the early days when we first set up in Glenrothes, and they had produced gloves for the MOD, very high spec. It was all they did, and the MOD was one of their biggest clients, obviously. The notice came out, they put in the tender, they filled in about half of it and said, well, that's fine, they know us, what's the point? And they lost the contract. They didn't get it. So, a huge impact. So, just assume no knowledge with your buyer. And I've put it down finally, but sometimes this is the most important one as well. Who are your competitors? Do you have a realistic chance? And that's where your research is going to tell you who's already got it. Again, I would encourage you to I don't know, but be as ambitious as you can. We've filled in tenders, we've met people at SDP training who are really quite small organisations, but they're very good at what they do. And they've been quite capable of putting a bid in and coming ahead in the scoring of some of the very large organisations. One we had was down in Ayrshire doing janitorial products, so cleaning, all that kind of stuff, hugely competitive. She put her bid in. Now, she wasn't actually selected, she just missed the cut, and she hadn't really tried very hard, she confessed. And the results came out, and she beat Bunzel by about 20 points. So, you know, if she'd just tried that little bit harder, and she did the next time, she got on the framework the next time around. So, yeah, consider competitors, but don't walk away too fast. Okay, the European Single Procurement Document, I've included this in terms of sort of improving your bid scores simply because this is part of the two-stage process of any tender. If it's something called a restricted tender, you'll get the ESPD stage first, and if you don't get through that, you won't even see the tender documents. So those are quite challenging types of restricted tender. If it's what they call the open tender, you still have to fill this part in first before you then go on and fill in your technical, how are you going to do the job, and the pricing. So either way, getting this bit right is quite important, more than quite important. It has replaced what used to be quite a standard PQQ document, which most of us learned to hate, simply because they could go on and on, they were very long. This is a very standard document, but the buyer can still decide which of the questions to use. I'll show you shortly where that is. It's focusing backwards essentially, so it should only ever be about where you are now and your current capability. If you see, and we have seen some of this, sometimes people put in questions that say, how will you do this? And how will you run the contract? And that's illegal, so you need to raise that and get the questions reordered so that they're backwards looking only. The contract notice that you see on PCS is the place where you should get all the information on what they call the selection criteria. So things like minimum turnover, insurance levels. The guy from Select was talking, so sometimes like membership of Select if you're an electrician, anything like that. However, it's not always in the contract notice. Sometimes you have to get into the tender documents to find that. This is just a kind of quick schematic of what the ESPD looks like. It's going to come in different formats. Sometimes people attach it as a Word document, and that's okay in the sense you can read through it, but there's quite a lot of questions that will say, I don't know, are you guilty of health and safety infringement, something like that. And you'll say no, but you've still got all the other if yes, and then a whole load of other questions that go with it. So it can be quite a tricky document to read in this format. Otherwise, PCS has what they call an online module, so you can fill it in more automatically there, and also PCS tender. The main bits to worry about, because parts 1, 2 and 3 are generally straightforward, tick the box, is the part 4 section, and this is the bit that the buyer can decide. And probably the most important part of that is where you have to talk about your examples of relevant projects. And very often that's scored, and if you don't get that right, that's the bit that might exclude you from going forward into the next stage. Other areas might be membership of technical bodies. You could be asked for lists of plant and equipment. You might be asked about supply chain, how you manage that. But effectively, most of the questions here are things you can prepare largely in advance. So again, if you've got any resource, you can spend a bit of time looking at this and getting these standard questions organised. And it's quite easy to log into PCS, look up a tender and download an ESPD, or you can Google it. It's on the Scottish Government website for the full ESPD document. Okay, so on to the kind of tips really for improving your score. They're probably endless, but I've tried to pick out the ones that I think are most important. It's absolutely critical that you write the content for the buyer's specific requirements. I think if you went round and did a kind of straw poll of the buyers here, one of the things that annoys them probably the most is the cut and paste scenario. So a document comes in, it's kind of not bang on, it's clearly been pulled in from the last bid that somebody did, and I've done this before, you've left in the name of the previous bidder you were bidding for and it's somebody completely different. So in general, you need to do a bit more effort to try and make it as specific as possible, because that's when the evaluators who are sitting with their 5 or 10 marks, they'll notice that and you will get a better score if you're gearing it to the actual opportunity. So your biggest clues are going to be in the documentation. So it's very tempting. We all kind of rush to the questionnaire, especially if it's PCS tender. You're filling it all in before you know, oh, great, I'm halfway through, I'm doing really well. But you absolutely must kind of stop first and read the terms and conditions. Okay, maybe not the final, very legal versions, definitely the specification, and anything else, guidance documents that you can find round about the tender, because that's going to tell you frequency of meetings, for example. It's going to give you the terminology. So do they refer to their person as a contract manager or contract administrator? I've seen quite often, I don't know if people do like care, social care contracts. Is it service user or people we care for? And that could be quite, important to pick that up. So as much as you can, and what I tend to do is literally almost handwritten or a few notes and say, here are the key issues, and then I can share that with the people writing the bid and also any partners that I've got or any subcontractors. And it keeps everyone focused on here's what the important issues are. It also means once you get deep down into the document, you might find yet another thing that you'd missed before that was a kind of a no deal that you don't want to cover. Get your questions in as soon as possible. So either PCS or PCS tender have the same Q&A facility, so don't leave it too late. The more you know is going to unlock and make it easier to write around. When it comes to the technical questions, this is the bit, what I would call the killer questions, where you're going to get a score. So these are the ones that you have to properly plan for. You need to provide evidence, really, other than opinions. And by that I mean what we would call it the blah blah. We're highly qualified, value for money, we exceed your every dream, we're mission, and it's all amazing and it's great. It's fine for your brochures, it's fine for your websites, but it's 0 points in a tender because it's your opinion, unless you can say, we're provide a high quality service and here's an example. We deliver on time in full for 90% of our last orders, or we will do this, we will do that. So, and it is quite hard, you just have to sit, and it's a good team kind of session to do as well. What makes us so good? What are our defining kind of key points? But nail it down to, I think somebody used a good one, I think something like 85% of our clients are return customers. So that's a much better way rather than saying we're very reliable and everybody likes us. So it gives it a bit more substance. Again, equally important, you have to structure your answers. And it is a bit like doing your O-grade English or history or something. Look at the question. It's usually divided into maybe 1 or 2 or 3 parts. So use those as your heading in your answer. And before you start writing, literally jot down the notes on what are we going to talk about, what evidence have we got to provide to back up the points, what statistics do we need a table, can we use a photograph, and literally look at the word count and say, right, what are we going to do in this answer? It can be absolutely challenging in some of the tenders to put a very big answer and you're maybe only given 500 words. And that's where the planning's critical, because quite often people do a good answer to the first 2 bits and they completely forget the third. And it happens every day of the week. We're seeing that in tender answers. So planning, very, very important. Assume no knowledge, sort of mentioned that before, so you have to be quite explicit in terms of what you do and why you do it. If you have the kind of word limits or the character limits, I think it's still quite good to do your big answer first and then boil it down, so you can still make sure you keep the salient parts. In my experience, if you start editing as you go along, you start cutting out a little bit, and then you get fiercer and fiercer as you go on because you're running out of words, and you start cutting out important things too soon. Something I do quite often, if I've looked at the specification and there's certain keywords and terms, and the buyer might say, we're looking for this, this, and this, I'll go back to my answer, and particularly if it's a big document, I'll do a word search, just using Word, or if you're in Excel, and quite often you're talking round about the subject, but you've not actually mentioned the term that the client's used. So you can go back in and make sure you do that. If you're putting in an answer where you're allowed to attach a document, then you will be able to use tables, graphs, and so on. If you're using PCS Tender, sometimes the buyer will only give you that little box with 2,000 characters. So total nightmare, and quite often it's not enough to say what you want to. However, in the scenario that you can expand things a bit, in your tender library I would start to develop some nice diagrams and tables. Organograms is fine, but things like what's your quality assurance approach? We would regularly use a table for that. So here's all the different parts of the job. At each stage, middle column, what's the quality check that goes on? So it might be a checklist, an inspection, proofreading, who does it? And then you've got a nice table to describe a quality management system. Even if you don't have ISO, that would still count. Communications is another one. How are you going to communicate? Same thing. Here's the stakeholder on the client side, who's the person on our side, and what's the means of communication, how often, reports, and again build up a table. If you're presenting using subheadings, again quite critical, I've mentioned earlier, particularly if you've got a question in multiple parts, but even if you don't, break the text up as much as you can. It's hugely difficult for an evaluator to read a big long screed. They quite often don't see things, and if they don't and you highlight it afterwards, they tend to say, your problem, not mine. We couldn't get it. We missed it. We didn't see it. In a very complex tender, we would probably put a compliance table at the front. So aside the contents, say, well, here's what you've asked for. Here's where you can find it. And it doesn't have to be an exact page. Just say, we've mentioned this, we've covered this in section 1, 2A, 3B. And then before they even read your tender, they know that you've actually covered everything that you've been asked for. And pictures can help, but just be sure that they're relevant. We had a client who had a lovely one, and it was to do with apprentices they'd taken on. So they had the photograph of the apprentices, all in their work gear, but a quote from the young lad as well. And that was a really nice, rather than them saying, we did quite well, it came across very strongly. Things like branded vehicles, if you've got that, equipment, if that's important, but don't use them, sort of overuse the pictures. And watch the file size as well. So community benefits will come up in virtually all tenders now. And this is an area that are quite high thresholds where legally they have to be used. But in our experience, particularly local authorities will want to know what else you can provide over and above the services that are going to be paid for. And it will come down to the sort of areas here in the first bullet point. So employment and training is useful. It doesn't have to be apprentices all the time. There are some very good documents. I don't know, Fife Council, if anyone's interested, has done a fabulous, I think they call it additional community service benefits leaflet with a whole shopping list of things that you can do that's not necessarily taking on new staff. We use, because we are a kind of virtual organisation, so we offer to do things like mock interviews and tie in with some of the career service and schools peoples. So this, again, in terms of your research, needs a bit of work. The tenders quite often give you links and people to speak to, and you can speak to them before the tender goes in as well. So if they have a community benefits officer, say it's a council you're bidding to, for sure I would definitely get on the phone to them and say, what's the deal? And they can help. They'll do the interviewing of people for work placements, there's employability schemes, and so on. You need to check out community groups, particularly if it's not in an area as well that you're working in yourself. Check if it's scored or not scored. So this is a bit tricky, and clearly if it is scored, you need to get a certain level of community benefit to merit a score, but you should be getting proper guidance in the tender documents to tell you how that's going to be evaluated. The buyer has to make sure it's linked and proportionate to the value of the contract. I've seen a few that are way over the top in terms of quite a small contract, but they're asking for massive contributions. So that can be challenged if you want to do that, and see if you can take it to the single point of inquiry would be an ultimate destination for that. Okay, and there might be a penalty for non-delivery. We're starting to see community benefit clauses where you maybe commit to doing some training or work placements. If you commit to 16 weeks or whatever, one local authority has asked you to pay in advance so many pounds for each week delivered. And if you deliver, you get your money back with interest. If you don't, the council's going to keep your money. Very unusual, but it would certainly be part of your contract management, so you're expected to report on it at the very least. Okay, and then just finally, a word about the tender desk and the tender library, because even already you can see, and you'll know from your own experience, you start to accumulate really quite a huge amount of information, and it does need maintaining. It's not enough just to write it up and then just kind of leave it on the shelf. So on the left-hand side is what I call the tender desk activity. So that's more where your research goes on. You'd be looking, obviously, tender search, maybe a plan, a schedule, so that you know in advance when the bids are coming out. You'll have files with all your completed tenders, which is fine. So that's like a sort of historical record of your tenders. And you should also keep a proper file of your results and feedback. So, and I know it's sometimes if you're getting the knockback, you tend to kind of just file it away. But each time you get the feedback, a bit of analysis, what were the results, what were we being told? And then on the right-hand side, what I would encourage you to do is, aside from just keeping all your tender documents all in one piece, I would start to be splitting some of the content back out so that you keep a folder of, say, content for quality questions, content for methodology questions, all the ESPD stuff, so insurance documents, certificates, and that's a really nice role to give somebody in your admin team as a kind of enhanced role, that they take charge of all of that and keep everything up to date. And then some of the other elements like your people information, for example. So it doesn't have to be an exotic database. We just use it in folders, for example, on the network drive. The other thing to think about is if you're the only one doing the tender, or there's only one or two of you, if you're on holiday or you're up in Aviemore at Meet the Buyer and somebody needs what's on your laptop, where are you going to store it so that it's available to other people as well? Okay, workshops and webinars, hopefully you're aware of, but that's a good way to sort of keep up to date with changes as well in developments too. Okay, I know it's been quite a quick sort of whiz through, but in our experience, we've seen lots of smaller organisations make huge improvements on their bids with just one or two changes and sort of paying a bit more attention, but it's time consuming. So yeah, we do appreciate it's a kind of nighttime weekend work for everybody as well. But I'll be around. There's another session after lunch. I'm happy to stay or go to the SDP stand as well. Thanks very much.